Hello and welcome back to episode 5 of the Stone Reform podcast series. Today we're talking about regenerating quarries, and joined by Burgess and Luca Csepely-Knorr. Would you both like to introduce yourselves and kind of your backgrounds? Both work at the University of Liverpool as tutors.
Yeah, so I'm Joy Burgess. My background is I studied landscape design and urban design. And worked for a landscape architecture practice for about a decade in London, and then freelanced before moving into research. So I'm coming towards the end of a PhD looking at women in post-war landscape architecture, so a kind of women's history project. And yeah, I sort of help Luca on various other things, projects that she has, often to do with history and landscape architecture. And yeah, I support her on tutoring at Liverpool as well.
And I'm Luca Csepely-Knorr. I studied landscape architecture and art and architecture history. I worked at the Manchester School of Architecture for more than a decade before joining Liverpool as a professor last year. And my interest in quarries comes from my historic research around Brenda Colvin and Sheila Haywood and other women who were very much involved in regenerating landscapes in the post-war period in Britain, and also beyond. And mining and mine restorations and quarries were a key question at that time, and gave some really good projects.
Brilliant. And yeah, so quite interesting in quarries. And what are some of the issues that both you kind of see with the actual quarrying process? Obviously there's a lot of quarries in the UK, and quarrying process isn't a great process ecologically, and yeah, so what sort of things do you kind of want to touch on in that?
Well, obviously it's an extractive industry, so it causes loads of damage to the environment when it's being started. However, quarries have been essential and are essential and probably going to be essential going forward. So I think what is interesting is how we can mitigate and how we can plan for the long-term future to somehow, balance the disruption that we cause to the landscape when creating quarries.
I think a big part of it, so often we've thought about, man versus nature, that idea of, what is our impact on the world? And obviously we have always had an impact. And a lot of the thinking, as I understand it, but Luca, you can probably speak to this, is the idea that trying to shift from the idea that we have man versus nature, that we're sort of in conflict with one another. And what does it mean to sort of have a more unitary model where, man and nature are working within a network together? And I think with quarrying, as Luca said, it is essential, it has always been essential, and actually we have quarried for as long as we have existed. We have always impacted the environment around us, and we've always used stone. Like, you can look at really ancient sites of cities being built, and they were, quarrying marble or whatever it was to create these ancient cities. So I think a big question is how do we think about quarrying from a balance of humans with nature? And I think sometimes that can be a more helpful dynamic, but it's not one, I think we have always just looked, or we can often talk about the damage of it, and I think a shift to a more sustainable way of looking at it in some ways is more helpful, because it is with us and it will always be with us in some way. So
yeah, not arguing against the actual item of quarrying, but arguing how you can not create that. I really like that idea that you created as kind of conflict, and yeah, what actually is the conflict that is going on at the moment in quarries is precise.
I mean, I think there are many different versions of conflict in every single infrastructure industrial landscape, including quarries, because it is, it's somehow essential to us to create, power stations create electricity, all those things, quarrying, creating stone, but it's something that is considered an eyesore. Obviously, it looks crazy, it doesn't look nice, but then equally, with new quarries, with extending quarries, we are making a massive biodiversity loss usually, which is a key key issue that needs to be mitigated. But I think if we look back to the post-war period, there are very good examples that are coming to be matured landscapes now where they try to mitigate the effects of quarrying in a very successful way. And I think that is important to celebrate those examples. So, for example, Hope Cement Works in Derbyshire was the first one that had a 50 years and 100 years landscape plan. Plan very carefully how you can use the areas that they're not quarrying anymore to give it back to nature and, you know, to landscape it back, which is a very interesting example. And there is also like Wharton Crag in Lancashire, which is now a very well-loved climbing area, which was re-landscaped by Brenda Colvin. And it was started to be landscaped during the quarrying period. They started to plant the trees to create shelters, but equally had a long-term plan of what's going to happen with the quarry when it closes. And I think there are many recreational opportunities like climbing or, you know, other things, nature reserves, nature trails and so on. And it can like turn around this idea of the quarry being sorely an eyesore in the landscape to something that is well used and liked.
Yeah. Do you think that social side is also quite important? Obviously you've got the ecological side of restoring biodiversity. Do you think that social side is also important? And
I think with all landscapes, the social side is very important, and I think that's why I quite like to work with examples from the post-war period, because I think they had an understanding of welfare, and welfare both for the landscape but also for the people who are going to use that landscape, and how to balance these dual needs of the people using the landscape, but the landscape staying and becoming more healthier and more biodiverse and climate friendly. And I think that is a very important thing, because, you know, people will want to use the landscape, and we want them to use the landscape because it's good for your mental and physical health and so on. So it is important. I think it's very important.
Yeah, that's really good.
I was going to say it's an interesting one, and I don't know. I don't know about an example like Hope Cement Works. Did they have that in mind? You know, when, because it was Geoffrey Jellicoe that came in first, wasn't it? And then Sheila Hayward, and then more people. Did their idea of how that will be managed change over time? Because, you know, it's interesting. It's an interesting question when you look at quarries and planning for when they are exhausted and their future. Like, I guess it would make a difference in terms of their design if we're planning for that connectedness to its local community right from the beginning. And I don't think that's always been the case. Maybe it was at Hope, I don't know. But I think it's certainly something that needs thinking about. How do we build in the future proofing of it right from the moment that you're going to start quarrying?
Yeah.
And that will have implications on how they quarry, and, you know, which spaces they quarry or don't quarry, and how, like, that kind of future designing is an important part. I don't know, do you know if, like, Jellicoe's idea, did it change over time, or was it?
Yes, it did change, because equally I think we learn more about ecology, we learn more about the environment, we have more scientific ways to understand ecology now. So I think while Jellicoe had a very clear idea from the beginning how to involve people in the reconstructed quarries with different sailing lakes and nature trails, and providing both for the people who work there but also people from the neighbouring valleys, he had an idea of creating a very sculptural form out of the quarry, which, like a landmark or a land art thing, would like sit within the peak. While later on, when environmentalism in the 70s and environmental consciousness became more and more and more important, it started to change how we think about these landscapes, what type of plants we do, you know, we put back in there, what type of soil we are using, and so on. So while he had a very interesting aesthetic view of it in the early 50s, I think ecology and biodiversity became more and more important, and others like Sheila Hayward or Sylvia Crowe and Brenda Colvin, and then later on others, started to argue for, you know, how you create properly ecologically restored landscapes.
But it's almost like you need both of those, because so Geoffrey Jellicoe was someone who really valued art, and he saw landscape as a kind of as part belonging to the arts, and he was like, he was on the board or something at the Tate, you know, he was really driven by how do we connect landscape as being an expression of art? And I think almost as we've moved towards a more very ecologically focused approach to quarries, I think there is a loss. And I think, you know, Jellicoe's idea that actually this, you know, this quarry as it is in some way a kind of a quite dramatic artistic sculpture, and trying to envisage it in that way, I think really changes how you might then manage it. And seeing the beauty in it and the drama of it, I think provides an opportunity for how do humans then relate to it. And I think sometimes that is lost in a very ecologically driven approach. And then that means often you might want to try and hide or cover over some of the drama of it, where actually there's maybe opportunity to, I don't know, to design within it but not be apologetic about its aesthetic.
And I think it's a very interesting question of how you see landscape and landscape's industrial heritage, because we have so many like industrial heritage buildings or, you know, mines that you can go and visit and, you know, as like celebrated parts of, you know, British industrial history, but for some reasons we never see landscapes as part of it. And I think quarries, for example, are very interesting examples of, yes, this is how it looks, you know, this is, you can show very clearly, this is the human's touch on the environment when you do a quarry, and you can use it for social, you know, for more like you know, different recreational uses. You can, you know, ecologically restore it, but equally you can look at it as an example of an industrial landscape that could be celebrated.
Yeah, it sounds like a balancing act of you know, that sort of social side, celebrating what the quarry is, and then also the ecological side of it. And are there any, in terms of restoring quarries, is there anything that you would say is really important ecologically in restoring quarries? Any techniques or?
I think what with all reconstruction projects, all ecology-based projects, you really need to look into what's natural, what's the natural vegetation there, and try to go back to it as much as you can. And it's again going to be a balancing act because of climate change. You know, what would survive there and what would thrive there might be different from what was there originally. But I think it's very important to look at, you know, what would have been there and try to match that as much as we can, and as biodiversely as we can. That's what.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's changed over time. I was looking, there's an example in Vancouver of somebody who he quarried for, I can't even remember what, but he quarried for, he was a factory owner. And then when he exhausted that, his wife, interestingly, decided to import a load of topsoil and import a load of plants and created from it a sunken garden. And then it was sort of finished in 1920 or something. And now, interestingly, when you look at it, there isn't, unless you have the knowledge that it once was a quarry, it's kind of, that history is hidden. And that, I think that idea was very much probably, well, I suspect, well, that is one school of thought, and I think we've moved a long way from that now. And I think often we look at things like spontaneous succession, where just allowing nature to repair itself, essentially, I think. And that is much more about sort of not trying to hide it, trying to, you know, see repair as acknowledging what has gone and being able to see those lines, but allowing nature to sort of be in control of that repair. But it is, you know, it's interesting how that has changed, and it is interesting looking at this sunken garden example, or times where they may have refilled a quarry with water and it's become, you know, a lake or whatever you might call it, and then actually there is, you know, it's hard to tell that it once was a quarry, and that does create its own kind of ecosystem that is new and that is different and that is thriving. So I guess there's no right and wrong in that. But we definitely, I think now there's much more talk about nature repairing itself and how as humans we can facilitate that and encourage that. But, you know, we wouldn't, the idea of bringing in loads of topsoil and loads of different plants, we wouldn't really do that now, you know, because it wouldn't be seen as sustainable in that way, would it?
But I also think that, you know, nature repairing itself is a long and slow process.
Yeah.
But I think we as humans need to understand and therefore I think it is very important to show that in different quarry environments, because what you cause nature when you quarry is something that you need to understand, and you also need to understand how long it takes to be repaired, because I think a more environmental conscious approach is very much needed, and these are parts of it. You know, how long does it take for a tree to grow? How long does it take for enough topsoil to be created in a quarry so that you can plant something in? Because I would hope that understanding the long-term processes and the timescales of these things would make people think twice about what they do to nature and how they approach nature.
And you talked about kind of spontaneous succession being quite a slow process. Is there a way of having a small level of intervention to kind of speed that process up slightly, or do you think it is best just to completely leave it, or kind of a mix of those sorts of approaches?
I think there are different approaches, and you know, both can be successful. So I know, for example, in Hope, whenever they start a new bit of the quarry, they keep the topsoil and use that topsoil in the older bits that they want to replant, which means that a vegetation, a soil, you know, with all the seeds in it and everything that is already established on that side and they know that going to thrive, can be put to a different bit of the quarry, which makes it obviously quicker. So for example, I think that is a very interesting approach of a bit by bit restoration of a quarry as they go along.
And in that sense, it is you are managing soil and you are managing the land in that way, but with with very much a sensitivity towards that local site, and trying to move soil as little as possible, which is a big factor. Often in big construction sites now, we try and move soil as little as possible. So if we can do that within a quarry context, then that makes for a more sustainable process of quarrying. If you have a plan to say, right, when we quarry here, we will move the soil over here for repair. I would say it's always good at looking at having at least some percentage of a quarry site where you do allow spontaneous succession, and I do think people do have like a graded approach. Where you might say, okay, we're going to leave 10, 15, 20% of it to spontaneous succession, and yet we're going to have a higher intervention here for this reason. And I think that's a realistic way of looking at it, as opposed to saying, you know, the whole site has to be left or none at all, you know.
Again, that highlights that sort of long-term plan that we talked about earlier, and planning if you can through the process and then out of the process as well. It's really interesting. And is there anything in terms of limestone quarries that you know of? Obviously it's an alkaline stone and the soil can become quite alkaline, as well as also wetlands as well, and I know you have problems with lakes and limestone quarries being quite alkaline, and they're looking really nice and blue and people want to swim in them, but I think does it burn your skin? Is there anything in terms of limestone quarries?
Well, I think it's going to be a case of you need to look at examples of limestone quarries that have been done 50, 70 years ago, or the restoration started then, and what worked there. I think, you know, limestone quarries are at a certain place, and that certain place has a natural vegetation, and probably that natural vegetation would thrive on that soil because it has always been there. I mean, in terms of, I think, quarries and lakes, it seems like something that's always done, that looks like a good idea to put a lake in it because it's nice, and it causes loads of these issues of like water safety, you know, what is in the water, you know, what will the water like wash out from the ground that has been quarried before. So I think, again, that's the balancing act thing, isn't it, of like creating something that would be amazing for people to go and visit. Equally, you don't want to create something that they cannot use then, because there will be someone who's going to go in, although there are signs not to go in. So I think that is, you know, that's why it's very important, I think, to always look at examples that have very similar conditions to the site that you are looking at, in terms of soil, climate, vegetation, and so on, really understanding the site and really understanding the history of the site. And I'm talking not industrial history, but natural history of like what was there before the quarrying started, and find examples that are very similar to that one to see what you can and what you cannot do with them.
But I think it's about having a broad set of possible interventions, you know, whether that is looking at like grading, you know, like levels, which often will help with soil retention and things, looking at managing soil in various different ways, like Luca was saying, and looking at opportunities of wetlands and water, because there are examples where it's worked really well as well, and just sort of having that, and the idea of local, having planting lists that are appropriate to that local site, and being able to think about how certain species could be introduced that might encourage a certain kind of ecosystem, and being able to manage that with a kind of a light touch. And I think having a set of tools that you can draw on is a really helpful way of then approaching a site, and bringing that you know, local context, and well, what's appropriate here, and you know, okay, so we understand the relationship between limestone and water, but maybe a wetland of a different kind that isn't going to look appealing to a human, would bring a different kind of ecosystem that could still be fantastic, you know. So seeing the different tools that are available when thinking about quarries, and ecological design and repair, and then working with those within your particular context, and you might find that certain things are totally inappropriate, or you know, but it will be very site specific, I guess.
Definitely.
Yeah, but
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, no, really interesting topics. And is there anything else that you think is worth drawing on, or do you think we've covered a lot of how to approach quarries, and also?
I think one more thing that I think is very important is that all quarries come with an existing infrastructure in terms of, you know, roads and so on. Yeah. And whatever you want to do with that quarry, I think what is important is to not go beyond that existing infrastructure. So you don't want to do something in a quarry that will mean you have to open 6 more roads, because that's just causing more problems, rather than trying to mitigate the problems already caused. So I think that is it's very interesting to look at quarries and the infrastructure that they already have. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to be as carbon low as possible by using things that are already there, the infrastructure, the buildings and so on, and use those when you want to create something new.
Yeah, really helpful. And I think I would we've already said it really, but that idea that we have quarried for as long as we have been, you know, as long as there have been humans, we've done it. And so there has been a lot of damage in recent years over quarrying, but trying to see, well, what is the opportunity, because it's not going away. And I think if we use our contemporary understanding of ecology and landscape architecture and all that can bring, I think we can shift our perspective to one where we can get it within balance, one that might connect to its larger community and to its larger ecology. And I think if we can achieve that, then there's great opportunity for city building, and for the impact that we as humans have on the world, for it not to be this idea of creating scars in a landscape and this very sort of pejorative way of looking at it, that we can find a way, I hope we can find a way of being more in balance, I think, while still quarrying and using the Earth's resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that always brings you back to that point that you said earlier about not having that sort of conflict between human and nature, and actually harmonising those as a holistic sort of view. So yeah, I think we'll end the podcast on that note. Thank you both for joining us on the Stone Reform podcast, and we'll see you all in the next episode 6.